There is a kind of silence that only gathers in a house that was built for prayer. It is not the silence of an empty room. It is a held silence, as though the walls have spent so many hundreds of years leaning toward a single voice that they cannot quite believe it has stopped. Up on Cold Fell, in a monastery given over to the winter, one man learned that the silence in that place was not empty at all. Something in it was still keeping the hours, and on the worst nights, it wanted him to keep them too. Good evening. Come in out of the cold and sit down before we climb up onto that fell, because this is a story that keeps to the old hours, and it is better told late, with the lamp turned low and the door shut fast against the dark. I'm the one who tells these tales. I gather the ones that people carry quietly for half their lives, the ones they will only set down at the very end of a long night, when they are too tired at last to go on guarding them, and I sit with each one until it settles into something I can hand across to you. Tonight's story came to me from a man who spent a single winter as the caretaker of a hillside monastery, keeping the buildings while the brothers were away, and who never afterward could hear a church bell in the small hours without going still and gray. So draw your chair up to the fire, and let me tell you about a cloister, a locked chapel, and an office that no living hand has rung for a very long time. The man at the heart of it had come to the work the way a good many men come to a quiet post, because the world had worn him thin, and he wanted a place its noise could not reach. He had lost someone the year before, in the ordinary and unanswerable way that people are lost, and had found he could no longer bear the company of the living, nor his own rooms with the empty chair in them. He was not a religious man, or did not think he was. But when he saw that a monastery on the northern fells wanted a caretaker to keep the place through the cold months, it seemed to him the nearest thing to disappearing that a living man could honestly do. He wrote to them, and they took him on. He would come to understand before the winter was over that there are places where a man goes to be alone, and that not one of them is ever quite as empty as it looks. The monastery stood high on the shoulder of Cold Fell, 3 miles of climbing track above the last village, in a fold of the hill where the wind came round the buildings on both sides and met itself again beyond. It was old, older than the village, older than the road, a long low huddle of gray stone with a squat church at its heart and a cloister running square around a garth of frozen grass. In the good months 12 brothers kept it, elderly men, the last of a shrinking house. But the buildings could not be warmed through the worst of the winter, and so each year, when the snow came down, the whole community went down to a grange in the dale and left the great cold house to keep itself until the spring. That was the caretaker's winter, to keep it, and let no roof fall in while the brothers were gone. He came up on the last cart before the snow closed the track, and the prior himself, the oldest of them and the last to leave, stayed past his own going to walk the new man through the place, the stoves, the oil store, the well, the long echoing walk of the cloister, patient and unhurried, the way old men are with a thing they are glad to be handing on. And then at the gate the prior told him the one thing that was in none of the papers he had signed. Put into my own words, it was this: keep the house and keep it well and walk where you please by day. But at the far end of the east walk of the cloister there is a chapel, an old one half fallen that is kept locked, and you are to leave it locked. And above all else, if ever you should wake in the dead middle of the night to a bell ringing from that end of the cloister, a small handbell tolling slow for the night office, and hear under it a single voice at prayer where you know there is no living soul, you are to stay in your bed. You are not to go and see. You are not to answer it. Whatever it seems to be asking, however you come to know the words, you are not to make the responses. Let it pray, keep to your room, and in the morning it will be only a locked door again. The caretaker took that for what it plainly sounded like, the sort of tale an old house grows the way an old tree grows moss, handed down from one keeper to the next because it made the long nights feel less empty. He thanked the prior, and he watched the cart go down and vanish into the dusk, and then he was alone on the fell with a ring of iron keys and the wind, and the great gray house settling around him into the dark. He lit the stove in the porter's lodge where he was to sleep, and he made himself tea, and he told himself it was only cold stone and only weather. And for that first night at least, there was nothing in the cloister but the wind, and the far streams running under the ice and his own footsteps going round. That much was still true. It would not stay true for long. He kept the house well those first days, and I want to be fair to him about that because it matters to what came after. He was a careful man, and the work suited the gray mood that was on him. He walked the corridors morning and evening with a lamp, and he fed the stoves, and he swept the drift of leaves that came in under the cloister doors, and he learned the great cold building the way you learn a face. The long north walk that never saw the sun, the chapter house with its ring of empty stone seats, the church with its cold altar and its rows of dark stalls where the brothers sat to sing. And at the far end of the east walk, past the last of the arches, he found the locked chapel the prior had spoken of. It was the oldest part of the whole place, plainly, a small, low, half-ruined thing, older than the church beside it, with a roof that had fallen in on one side long ago and been rudely patched, and one narrow window of thick old glass, and a heavy door with a black iron lock that his keys did not fit. He stood before it more than once in those first days, in the gray afternoon light, and felt nothing from it but the ordinary sadness of a broken thing left to the weather. He put his hand flat on the cold wood of the door once, and it was only wood. He was almost disappointed. He went back to his stoves. The snow came in earnest on his fifth or sixth night, and it changed the quality of the dark. It came down without any wind at all, straight and silent and steady, until the whole fell was muffled under it, and the last small sounds of the world, the streams, the distant valley, were smothered one by one, and the silence that the prior's rule had hinted at came down over the monastery like a held breath. He lay in his narrow bed in the porter's lodge that night and listened to the sheer size of the quiet, and could not sleep for the weight of it. And it was somewhere in the dead middle of that night, at the low black hour when even the fell seemed to have stopped, that he first heard the bell. It was a small bell, a handbell by the sound, the kind a man might carry and swing, not the great cast bell in the church tower, but a light bright chime with a mortal hand behind it, close and clear across the snow. And it was not ringing at random. It rang slow and deliberate and evenly spaced, the way a bell is rung to call men to prayer, a summons and not an accident, tolling out of the far end of the cloister where the locked chapel stood, and where there was no living soul but himself in 3 miles of snow. He sat up in the black cold with his heart going hard, and he told himself, the way you do, that a rope had come loose somewhere, that the frost had shifted an old fitting, that there was a mortal and mechanical reason for it if only he went and found it. But a loose bell swings and clatters. This one kept time. It kept the slow, patient, unhurried time of a thing being done properly, by someone in no doubt of what he was about. And as the caretaker sat and listened to it toll out of the buried dark, some older and wiser part of him understood, before his reason would allow it, that no rope and no frost had ever rung a bell like that. And then under the bell, so faint at first that he took it for the blood in his own ears, there came a voice. It was a man's voice, and it was singing not a song, but the long, level, rising and falling line of plain chant, the old wordless-seeming chant of the monastic office, one phrase given out and then a silence, and then the phrase answered by the same single voice taking up the next. It came from the far end of the cloister, from the direction of the locked chapel, low and unhurried and grave, and it was the loneliest sound he had ever heard in his life, because it was the sound of a man keeping the night office entirely alone, one voice doing the work of a whole choir, calling and answering himself, in a chapel where the prior had sworn to him no one had prayed in longer than living memory. He did not go and see. He wants me to tell you that, and I will. Whatever cold sense the prior's words had left in him held him where he was, sitting up in his bed with the blanket gripped in both hands, listening to a dead man sing the hours out of the snow. The bell tolled, and the single voice rose and fell and answered itself, and it went on for the better part of an hour by his watch, until the black turned toward gray, and the chant sank down and thinned and faded, and the bell rang once more and was still. And in the morning, when he made himself walk down the east cloister in the hard, clean daylight, there was only the locked chapel at the end of it, silent, its narrow window dark, its black lock cold, and the snow before its door lying smooth and unbroken, with not one footprint anywhere upon it, going in or coming out. He did not sleep much the next day, and I don't suppose any of us would have. He went about his work in a kind of daze, and all the while some part of him kept returning to the sound of it, not to the fear of it exactly, but to the terrible loneliness in it, the patience of a man singing both halves of a prayer to himself because no one was left to sing the other half. That was the thing that got under his guard. He could have borne a horror more easily than he could bear that. And he found, as the short day dimmed toward another long night, that he was not so much dreading the bell as waiting for it. It came again in the dead hour, as he had known it would. The snow had held, and the silence with it, and the small clear bell tolled up out of the far dark exactly as before, slow and grave and certain, and under it the single voice rose into the chant. And this time the caretaker did not stay in his bed. He tells me he does not fully know why, only that the loneliness of it drew him the way warmth draws a cold man, and that he thought God help him, he thought, that there could be no great harm in only looking, in only seeing with his own eyes the thing that grieved so. He took up his lamp, and he went out into the cloister, into the black cold, and he walked the long east walk toward the sound. The chant grew as he went, and the bell with it, until he came to the last arch before the locked chapel and stopped, because there was light ahead of him where there had no business being any. The narrow old window of the ruined chapel, the one dark pane he had passed a dozen times by day, was glowing. It was a warm light, a low, steady, golden light, the color of many candles or of a fire well kept, spilling out through the thick old glass onto the snow, and it should not have been there at all, for the chapel was locked and empty and half open to the sky, and no man had carried a candle into it in 50 years. But it glowed, warm and golden and alive, in the one place on that whole frozen fell where warmth could not be. And out of it came the bell and the grave, unhurried voice, keeping the office. He went closer, unable to help it, and came up to the window with his own lamp shaking in his hand, and he looked in through the old warped glass, and this is what he saw, and he swore it to me, and I believed him. The chapel within was whole, not ruined, whole and warm and lit, as it must have been long ago, with candles burning in it and the fallen roof somehow entire overhead, a small snug space of gold light in the middle of the buried dark. There were old carved stalls along one wall, the kind the brothers sat in to sing, and in one of them alone sat the shape of a man in the dark habit of the house, his head bowed over a book, his hands folded, keeping the office. The caretaker could not see his face, and was glad of it, for the man's hood was up. Only the dark curve of him bent over his prayer in the candlelight, rising to give out the chant, and sinking again to answer it, alone, alone, as he had plainly been alone in that warm gold room for longer than the caretaker's whole life. And then the caretaker saw the thing that turned his blood, though there was nothing violent in it at all. Beside the bowed figure in the row of stalls there was an empty place, and it had been made ready. A book lay open upon its ledge, and a candle burned beside it, unlit by any hand he could see, and the whole small, warm room seemed arranged around that one waiting seat as though it had been kept ready, night after night, year after year, for someone who had not yet come to fill it. And as the chant reached the end of a phrase and fell into its silence, the caretaker understood, standing frozen at the glass, that the silence was the place where the other voice should come. The bowed man was not singing both halves of the office because he wished to. He was singing both halves because he was waiting, in every held silence, for a second voice to take up the answer. And the empty stall and the open book and the lit candle were for whoever would. He did not answer it. He stood at the window with the response rising in his own throat like water, wanting to be given, for the shape of the chant was so old and so patient that some part of him already knew where the answer fell, and he shut his teeth on it, and he stepped back from the glass. The gold light did not follow him. The bowed figure did not lift its head. But as he turned and went back down the long, dark cloister, faster than he wanted to admit, he felt the whole warm, waiting quiet of the place lean after him. Gently, the way a lonely man leans toward the one visitor who has come to his door in years and does not want him to go. He could not let it lie after that, and I don't suppose any of us could have. The chant had stopped being a horror to him somewhere at that lit window and had become a question, and a man can run from a horror, but he cannot easily run from a question that grieves him. So the next day, instead of sleeping, he went looking for what the house itself remembered. There was a room off the cloister that served the community as a kind of library and records room, cold and dry, its shelves stacked with the ledgers and account books and registers of a house that had kept its own memory in ink for centuries. If the answer to the bell was anywhere, he thought, it was there. He lit a lamp against the gray, and he began to read. It took him 2 days. He read the annals of the house, the plain year-by-year setting down of a monastery's small business, the harvests, the deaths, the visitations, the endless keeping of the hours. And folded in among the older books he found the one that mattered, a heavy worn register that had been the porter's book, the record kept at the gate by the brother whose office it was to answer the door of the house, to take in the traveler, to feed the poor, to turn the wheel of hospitality that such a place had turned for 1,000 years. He read it backward, from the newer hands toward the old, and near the middle of it, in a winter of long ago, he found the thing he had been afraid he would find. And the story he pieced together from that book, and from the annals beside it, put into my own words and softened where it needs to be, was this. There had been a brother in that house in the hard years who kept the gate, the porter, the one who answered the door. A grave and careful man, by all the book showed of him, exact in his duties, never late to the office, never once at fault in the small daily rule of the place. And on a night of terrible snow, a night much like the ones now closing over the fell, someone had come up the track to the gate of the monastery in the dark, seeking shelter. A woman, the porter's book had it, with a child, travelers caught by the weather on the high road, half dead with cold, begging at the door of a house that existed, that had always existed, for exactly such nights as that. And the brother at the gate had not let them in. The caretaker read the reasons the man had written for himself, and they were the small gray reasonable reasons that let a decent person do a terrible thing. That the rule of the house forbade a woman pass the gate at that hour. That he could not be sure they were what they seemed, and the house had been robbed before by those who played on its charity. That the guest master was abed and it was not his, the porter's, place to decide. That they could go down to the village, which was only 3 miles, and be taken in there. Reason on reason, each one true enough, and the sum of them was that he had turned a mother and a child away from a warm door into the snow and barred it and gone back to his prayers. And in the spring, when the drifts went off the fell, they had been found not half a mile below the gate, where the cold had taken them in the night, sitting down together in the snow the way the frozen do, as though only resting. That much was in the porter's book, in the man's own hand, in a script that grew smaller and more crabbed as it went, as though he could barely bear to shape the words. But it was the annals of the house that told the rest, and the caretaker read it late, by the failing lamp, with the cold coming up through the floor. The brother had never confessed it. That was the heart of the whole matter. He had gone to his confession as every brother did, and he had told his small daily faults, his idle thoughts and his lapses at prayer, and this one thing, the great gray killing thing he had done at the gate, he had never once been able to speak aloud. He had carried it unshriven and unabsolved to the end of his days, keeping the office faithfully, keeping the rule exactly, a man perfect in everything but the one thing that mattered, and he had died at last still holding it, unforgiven because unconfessed, and had asked in his last illness only this: to be buried not in the brother's ground but apart, in the old ruined chapel at the far end of the cloister, so that he might go on keeping the night office there, alone, and go on praying to be forgiven for a fault he could not bring himself to name, for as long as it took. And the house, not knowing the whole of why, had granted it, and he had been keeping it ever since. The caretaker closed the porter's book with hands that were not quite steady, and he understood at last what it was that sang in the dark at the far end of the cloister, and what the empty stall was for. It was not a monster keeping vigil in that warm gold room. It was a man, a grave, exact, terribly ordinary man, who had done one cold thing on one cold night and had never been able to say it, and who had been kneeling in the dark ever since, keeping the office and begging to be forgiven, and getting no answer, because the only voice that could answer him was one he could not raise himself. You cannot forgive yourself. That is the whole cruelty of it. He had sung both halves of the office for 50 years and more, calling into the silence and answering himself, because absolution is a thing that must come from another voice, and no other voice had ever come. And the seat stood empty, and the candle burned, and the book lay open, waiting, night after night, for whoever would at last come and make the response. He knew now what the prior's rule had been guarding him from, and it was not what he had thought. The danger was not that the thing in the chapel would harm him. The danger was that it would ask him to help, in the one way it knew how to ask, and that he would say yes, for the office wants two voices. And a lonely man who has kept it alone for half a century, and who feels a living warmth come at last to his window in the dark, will draw that warmth toward the empty stall with everything he has, and hold the silence open for it, and wait for it to sing the answer, and a living man who sits down in that stall and takes up that response might never rise from it again. He might keep the night office in that warm gold room forever, a second bowed shape in the candlelight, so that the first would no longer be alone. That was the mercy the dead man wanted, and it was a mercy that would cost a living soul everything. The prior had known it. Keep to your bed, he had said. Do not answer. Let it pray. The worst night of that winter came near the end of it, and the caretaker knew it would be a bad one from the moment the light went out of the sky, because the snow came down heavier than he had seen it yet, and the silence with it was total, a silence with a shape to it, a silence that seemed to be waiting for him particularly. He sat up in the porter's lodge with the lamp lit, and the porter's book on the table before him, and swore to himself that he would not go out, whatever came. And in the dead hour the bell began. It was different that night. It rang, and the single voice rose into the chant as it always did, but this time in the first held silence where the answer should fall, the voice did not answer itself. It waited. It left the silence open, and it held it open longer than any breath, and the caretaker felt the whole of that held silence turn toward him across the snow, toward the porter's lodge, toward the one warm living thing on the whole frozen fell, and he understood that the dead brother knew now that he had come, and had read the book and knew the words and could give the answer, and was being asked, in that aching open silence, to come and give it. He got up from the table. He does not think he told himself to. He found himself in the cloister with the lamp in his hand and the snow whispering down, walking the long east walk toward the warm gold light in the window, and the bell tolling him on, and the silence held open before him like a door. And when he came to the chapel this time, the door was not locked. It stood open, and the gold light spilled out warm across the snow, and within was the small whole candle-lit room and the bowed figure in its stall, and beside it the empty place made ready, the open book, the lit candle, the worn ledge worn smooth as though by the hands of one who had waited a long time to see it filled. And the figure lifted its head. It did not show him a face. He was spared that, and I am glad for him. It only turned in the candlelight toward the empty stall beside it, and toward him in the doorway, and it held the silence open, and it waited for him to come in out of the cold and sit down, and take up the book, and sing the answer, and never be cold or alone again. And the caretaker felt his foot cross the threshold, and felt the warmth of that room reach out and fold around him like the arms of the thing he had lost the year before, and heard, rising in his own throat, unbidden, the first note of the response. What stopped him in the end was not the prior's rule, and it was not fear. It was the porter's book, and the one thing in it he had not been able to put down, that the man in the stall was not truly asking to be joined. He only thought he was. He had knelt so long in the dark that he had come to believe what he needed was a second voice to share the endless keeping of the hours. But the caretaker understood, standing on that threshold with the response dying in his throat, what the man in the stall did not, that to sit down in that empty place would not free the brother. It would only bind them both, two bowed shapes keeping a vigil that could never end. What the office was truly waiting for had never been a second singer. It was an answer of another kind, not the response of the prayer, but the response to the man. So he did not sit down. He stood in the doorway with the silence held open and every cold hour of that winter pulling him toward the empty stall, and instead of singing the answer the office wanted, he gave the answer the man wanted, the one no one had ever given him. He spoke into the held silence, aloud in his own plain living voice, and did for the brother the thing the brother had never been able to do for himself. He named the fault. He said what had been done at the gate on the night of the snow, the whole gray killing truth of it, spoken plainly at last. The confession the man could never make with his own mouth, made for him now by another. And then he said the rest of it, the part that mattered more. He said that it was known and heard, and at the very last forgiven, that the woman and the child in the snow, wherever the mercy of the world had taken them, did not hold it against him any longer, and that he could lay it down. He forgave him, not as a priest, for he was no priest, and I do not think it needed one, but the way one cold and grieving human being can forgive another across whatever gulf it is that lies between the living and the dead, completely, out loud, and with the whole of his own broken heart. And the office finished. He tells me the silence that had been held open so long simply closed, gently, the way a held breath is finally let go, and that the bowed figure in the stall lifted its head at last, not toward him, but upward, the way a man looks up when a great weight is lifted off him from above. He only knows that the grave, unhurried voice gave out one more phrase of the chant, the last of it, the end of the office, and that this time, for the first time in half a century, it did not have to answer itself. And then the candles in that warm gold room burned down together and went out, and the light left the window, and the caretaker was standing alone in the doorway of a cold ruined chapel open to the snow and the stars, an old locked door swinging quietly on its hinge, and a great and final silence that had, at last, nothing left in it that was waiting. He kept the rest of his winter on cold fell, and the bell never rang again. When the snow went off the track in the spring and the brothers came back up from the dale, he told the prior only that the house had been quiet, and the old man looked at him a long moment and asked him nothing more, as though he could see for himself that the far chapel was only a locked door now, and would stay one. He went down off the fell when his work was done, and he did not disappear as he had meant to, and I think that is the truest part of it. He had gone up there to be alone with his own grief, and had come down having sat with someone else's, having done the one thing his own year of loss had taught him the worth of, to tell a soul in the dark that it is heard, and forgiven, and may at last put its burden down. I've thought a good deal about why he carried this so long before he gave it to me, and I think it is the shape of the mercy in it, that the thing keeping the office on the fell was never a horror at all, but a penance no one had ever come to end. Because the dead are not always out there to frighten us, or to take something from us. Sometimes they are only kneeling in the dark, keeping a vigil they were never absolved of, waiting with a patience that ought to break your heart for one living voice to come and say the words that let them rest. Not everything that keeps the hours in the dark means you harm. Some of it is only waiting to be forgiven. That's where I'll leave him and leave you, with a chapel gone quiet, an office finished at last, and one grave and ordinary soul let go home after a very long night. If you'd sit up in the small hours for a story like this one, then do me a kindness before you go. Like it, share it, and subscribe, so the next tale finds its way to you when the dark comes down. And if the comments are open, tell me, have you ever felt, alone in some old and quiet place, that you were not quite the only one keeping watch? Sleep well if you can. Keep a light burning in the window if you'd rather, for anyone still out in the cold. And if you ever wake in the dead hour to a bell you cannot account for, and a lonely voice at prayer where there should be none, be careful and be wise, and keep to your bed as the wise ones tell you. But do not be too quick to call it a monster. Some of the dead are only still praying to be forgiven, and the bravest thing a living soul can do when the night office calls is to find the words that let it stop. Good night.